Welcome to Talmudic Treasures. Today we're learning Yevamot, page 55, which once again discusses a very sensitive topic regarding an individual who's engaged in marital relations in a very unusual manner. Now, even though on the surface a novice studier of the Talmud would not understand why these things are mentioned, but again, as we've mentioned previously, this shows the absolute truth of how the Torah is, that there's nothing that is off the table. There is nothing that cannot be discussed, provided that we understand that we're doing so in order to be able to reach a deeper conclusion, to be able to understand the absolute truth of our holy Torah. So we've been discussing, when it comes to marital relations, what constitutes as having completed this act of marital relations. Now, one would imagine it's only at a time when the man literally finishes with a seminal emission. However, the Talmud here tells us that that is actually not the case. When it comes to almost all situations, even the beginning of a sexual encounter would constitute enough that if it would be a forbidden relationship, that party would be held accountable for such actions, even though they didn't actually finish their action of having relations. Now, it then discusses something which is extremely hard to imagine that the Talmud would ever talk about, and this is discussing the issue of Necrofilia, which is literally having relations with a corpse, which, of course, in American law is actually a felony. And therefore, it's hard to imagine why is the Talmud even discussing this. Obviously, we're holding and discussing and learning with people who are holy and great, not something that anyone in a million years would even contemplate. So the Talmud is doing this because it wants to be able to understand what constitutes marriage. We know that a husband and wife are considered to be bound to one another, and therefore this woman is not allowed to marry another man unless either a divorce document is given or if her husband dies. The question is, when the woman dies, is this woman still considered to be a married woman to the extent that if a person would have relations with her in that state of having already been dead, is that considered to be legally Eshes Ish, being with a married woman and having committed adultery? And the reason why we even would think this is because when it comes to a Kohen who typically cannot become impure and cannot go to cemeteries, we make 7 exceptions, his closest relatives, namely his mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, and a spouse. If his wife died, the Torah says that he can go to her funeral and become impure because she is shero, which literally means his wife, which sounds like on some level, even though she has died, he and she are still considered to be legally somewhat married to the extent that he's allowed to become impure, which is the law. And therefore, because of that, one can maybe think that one would even commit adultery having relations with such a woman. And therefore, the Talmud needs to explain that that's not the case. Again, the reason for this is not to teach us what the law is for someone who unfortunately is suffering a mental illness and is engaged in such behavior. But the Talmud says unusual circumstances, so therefore we could draw lines and understand what constitutes marriage, what is no longer considered to be married, and what are the punishments and consequences of actions in each of these scenarios.